What's going on, everybody? Today we are going to be talking about the 20% rule, which is the equivalent rule to the 1% rule when it comes to long-term rentals. So you've likely heard about the 1.1% rule. At least most people have who have really gotten into real estate in one way or another. And I've had people ask me over and over and over again, is there something that is similar to the 1% rule, but for short-term rentals? And I've talked about this on probably every single podcast I've ever been on, every single presentation I've done. I've definitely talked about it. And it's called the 20% rule. And the 20% rule is used to be able to look at a market from a very, very high level and know if there is some sort of potential down there for cash flow. Okay. Because that's what we care about a lot when it comes to short-term rentals. Now, with that being said, I'm going to rip apart the 20% rule, the rule that I have been trying to get everyone to understand. I'm actually going to show you how it breaks, because it does break at different purchase prices. And I'm going to walk you through underwriting so that you can understand exactly how that happens. Okay. It's not super simple. All right. It's not simple what we're going to go through here. There's going to be a lot of numbers we're going to look at. There's a lot of different scenarios we're going to look at, but I'm going to try and make it make sense as best as I possibly can. And then what I'm going to do is show you how you can actually use this in the real world to go out and try and find a market that has cash flow potential. I've studied 400 markets myself, more than that actually at this point, and I have about 20 that work really well. And so this speeds up your process to being able to find markets that actually cash flow, but you have to understand the nuances of the rule. And I'm finally, for the very first time, going to break it down. All right. So with that being said, what is the 20% rule exactly? Like, what does this actually mean? Well, typically, and just at a very high level, this is how you would use it. If the purchase price of a property was $300,000, then the 20% rule would tell you that you can buy, as long as the revenue on that property is $60,000, you should be happy, and it's a property that's worth purchasing. And I'm telling you right now, that's not true for this. It's just not true. And so then therefore, where does this rule actually break? And how can we understand it a little better? That's what we're going to go through. All right. So again, just to say that one more time, a little bit more clearly, if the purchase price is $600,000, the revenue should be 20% of the purchase price. And that's the 20% rule. And if you can find that, you generally should be happy with the purchase of the property. So with that being said, I'm actually going to start off with the $600,000 example, because that is typically the median home price for a vacation home in America. So about $583,000 is what we're seeing as the median price. And this is where the rule works beautifully for the most part. Everyone's pretty happy with this one, right around that $600,000 example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through these different underwriting examples without going into great depths. You can scrutinize my underwriting all you want when you review it, but I'm going to show you very high level what we're looking at, and then I'm going to explain to you the cash on cash that we're seeing based off of this price to rent ratio. Okay. So the one variable that's staying the same in each of these is that the down payment is going to be 20%. The interest rate is going to be about 7.25. The closing costs are going to stay the same. The only thing that's really going to change here is that the optimization list, so what it costs to get that property up and running, is going to change. And then the operating expenses are going to change slightly. All right. We're going to talk about that one a little bit later. And so what we're going to do is go through a $600,000 example, a $300,000 example, and then a $1.5 million example as well. All right. So in this $600,000 example, the purchase price is obviously $600,000. And so then therefore the revenue should be, based off of the price to rent ratio, about $120,000 a year. And what you can see here is that the cash on cash, which is the metric that most people care about when it comes to short-term rentals, is just over 10%. And now most people are going to be happy with that number at a minimum, because even if we were to go down, let's say we go to $110,000, we're still at a 7% cash on cash. Most people, and again, I've worked with hundreds of people now at this point, helping them identify and find short-term rentals. Most people are generally going to be happy with about a 10% cash on cash. They're not going to be angry. They obviously want more. They want to see if they can get to a 15, 20. Some people want a 40% cash on cash. It is what it is. But what I'm trying to say is that most people are going to be happy if they see a 10% cash on cash. This property could bring in about $30,000 of free cash flow. And that's if the property made $120,000 a year, which would be that exact 20% price to rent ratio for this property. And when I'm picturing this, I'm picturing something that looks like this, right? So I want to give you examples as we go through each of these so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm referring to. This is a really well amenitized property. There's a lot of great photos and amenities stacked up, and the order of the photos is beautiful. But the home itself is going to be roughly around that $600,000 purchase price, right? And that's what the end product could look like. And if it looked like that, you bought it for this amount, it made $120,000, you could be walking away with $30,000 in free cash flow, and about a 10% cash on cash. And that's because the 20% rule works really well around that median vacation home sales price, right? Of $500,000 to about $700,000. And since that one is the most common, that's why I always talk about the 20% rule. But now what I want to do is break it and show you where it actually doesn't work at all. And that's when we go the opposite way. So this purchase price was $600,000. What if the purchase price was $300,000, right? So we're going to cut that in half. Well, at $300,000, the revenue should be $60,000. That's what our price rent ratio tells us here. It should be $60,000. Well, what you can see is that the cash on cash drops to about 4.3%, right? Which is more than half of what it was earlier. So the 20% rule was worked out great here to hit that 10% cash on cash. But down here, we're actually quite a bit lower. We're closer to a 4% cash on cash. Now, at 4%, some people are still going to be happy with that, but from my experience, significantly less, right? Especially if that's your worst case scenario, or if that's your median scenario or your high scenario, and 60% is the, what you're expecting to make. Because what if you hit 50,000, right? If we went to 50,000 here, all of a sudden we're negative cash flow and negative cash on cash. And so then therefore, the 20% rule can't be your guiding metric when it comes to a lower purchase price property. It actually has to be moved up, right? And as you can see here, at the 23% price rent ratio, we do see that 10% cash on cash. And so then therefore, only about 3% more of a price rent ratio is where you start to see the same type of returns. But you can't just use that blanket 20% on a lower purchase price, because then you're going to more than likely end up with a property that you're not going to be happy with rather than happy with. And when it comes to these smaller properties, you can see here, we only jump about $7,500 in revenue, but yet the cash on cash more than doubles. And that's just because with smaller properties, these tiny little increments can take your free cash flow from $5,500 all the way to $13,000, because there's no increase in the operating expenses. It's just your ability to get a higher nightly rate. And so the increase in cash flow is, over 100%, right? But your increase over here is a fraction of that. And that's why you're seeing a big jump with such a small increase here. So anyways, rule of thumb, what I'm trying to get across here is that when you are getting into these smaller purchase prices, I like to try and focus around the 25% price rent ratio, because it gives me a little bit of a buffer when I'm looking at those. But people will be happy with, a 10% cash on cash. And we're looking at a 23% price rent ratio. People would be happy with that. So you can go out and look for a 23% price to rent ratio for a smaller purchase price. But just keep in mind, if this now goes down to 200,000, you're going for those really small, cute places, everything changes, right? So now the 20% on that would be 40,000, right? And at 40,000, we're actually losing money. And so I'm just trying to call this out, right? The lower that purchase price goes, the higher your price to rent ratio needs to be for this to be something that is worth pursuing. All right. So hopefully that's making sense as we're going through. I think you generally get the gist of it. And if you haven't figured it out already, let's go take a look at the $1.5 million deal here, which is the exact opposite of all of that, right? So at 1.5 million, if 20% of 1.5 million is 300,000, and if you were to make 300,000, you would be extraordinarily happy with a 20% return, bringing in over almost $120,000 a year. But the reality is that you don't need to do that, and a lot of people are happy with less than that. They'll move on a deal for less than that, right? A lot of people will. I know some people watching this are like, no, that's what I'm going for. And that's great too. But from my experience, a lot of people would be very, very happy with this 10% cash on cash. And that's only a 16% price to rent ratio. Meaning if you're going to look into one of these markets, and you're seeing a $1.5 million home, just know in the back of your head that it doesn't need to be the 20% rule. It can actually even be closer to a 15% price to rent ratio. All right. And so the $1 million purchase is the same general idea. It's an 18% price to rent ratio rather than the 20% price to rent ratio. So you get the idea. What I'm trying to get across here, guys, is that the lower the purchase price, the higher the price to rent ratio. The higher the purchase price, the lower the price to rent ratio. And the cash flow, or the cash on cash in this case, would stay relatively similar. All right. And so then, therefore, if you're trying to use this 20% rule, you have to pay attention to the purchase price of the properties in the area you're going to look into, so that you can know if you're using the 25% rule, the 20% rule, or the 15% rule, because it's not as simple as the long-term rental world where they just have the 1% rule. Short-term rentals are a lot more complicated, as you have found out after, if you've watched all my videos. Short-term rentals, far more complicated. With that being said, I want to break down two things here. The first thing is that the reason this is happening in the way that it's happening, or one of the reasons anyways, is that certain operating expenses don't increase just because the purchase price of the property increased. So for $1 million property, your internet could be about $100. It may be, maybe you need an extender, and maybe it's $125, but it's about $100. On a $300,000 purchase, it's also roughly going to be about $100, right? It's not going to, it doesn't increase just because of the size of your property that you're renting out. It doesn't perfectly, you understand what I'm trying to say. I completely botched that, but you get the general idea of what I'm trying to say. To get internet into the house, it's going to cost a base amount. And if you buy a $300,000 home or an $800,000 home, you're roughly paying $100 for that internet regardless. But the $800,000 home, right? Let's look at the $1 million purchase here. The $1 million home here is going to be a lot larger. It have more amenities, offer more value. There's more people that can rent it out, more families that can rent it out together, giving it the ability to make quite a bit more in comparison to a home that would be a smaller $300,000 home, like something like this. And so then, therefore, your revenue can naturally be a lot higher for a more expensive type of home. However, your internet is not really going to go up. The software that you use to manage that is not really going to change. The hot tub maintenance is not going to change either. The pest control may go up a little bit, but there's still some base amount that you have to pay on the smaller home in the first place, just to get somebody out there to do it. And so then, therefore, what I'm trying to explain is that these expenses will stay the same if you make $70,000 or $300,000. And that difference is what allows you to have more cash flow, which allows you to have more cash on cash, right? So that's one of the things that I wanted to explain. The next thing I wanted to explain is, how do I use this in the real world, right? How do I actually apply this and go and look to find a market? And I want to stress this, all right? The 20% rule is the most effective when you are looking into a market from a 10,000 foot view, trying to determine if that market is worth deep diving and truly building out a buy box. For myself, I have some markets that I've taken a week to study to truly understand if it makes sense to even invest in that market or not. And sometimes I'll spend all that time and there's nothing. I looked everywhere and I found nothing. And so this rule is super practical if you are somebody in a situation who's trying to figure out, where can I invest, right? Where are all these different markets? And you want to know very quickly if a market is good or bad, okay? And so this is the process that I want to show you. I actually did this live with a client yesterday, and just to show them that this was one of their favorite markets to go to as a family. And I'm like, okay, well, I've never looked into the market. Let me look into it live with you, and I'll see if it makes sense or not. And within 2 minutes, I could tell them that this was not going to work out. So this is a little market called Sapphire in North Carolina. And the first thing I did was I went and grabbed the data for the Sapphire area. And I noticed something almost automatically. Every single one of the top comps here had unbelievable views. And they were making, 170, 160, 190. And then once you scroll a little bit further down, you start to get to these properties without views. All of these ones you can see right here, and they're all roughly making $75,000, right? And so I go, okay, if I'm trying to do this quickly, I can see that a property without a view, let's call it $75,000, $80,000. A property with a view, potentially all the way up to like 190, 180, whatever you want to call it. And so Then what you do is you go and look at the properties that are for sale, and you scroll through and you realize, okay, like let me try and find a property that has a really nice view. Okay, here's one with a really nice view. And you click into it and you realize that the purchase price is $1.75 million. Well, what does that look like if we underwrote it, right? So we go 1.75, 1, 2. Let me actually use the $1.5 million underwriting sheet here so that the operating expenses are a little bit more dialed in. And so I go $1.7 million, $1.75 million there. And the max we're seeing is like 180, let's say. Let's put it right at 180. So then I go over here and say, well, what if this property makes $180,000? The first thing I want you to notice is that the price to rent ratio is 10%. And what you'll also notice is that the property should lose about $20,000 a year. So at a 10% price to rent ratio, the property is losing money. And that's the best case scenario from what we're seeing here, right? Maybe I could get up to 190, but I'm still going to be losing money in that scenario. And so then therefore, if I go out and buy that property, it's not going to make sense. And if you even look a little further down, you can see another one with good views that's selling for $3.7 million. You go, well, that's obviously not going to work. And so then we have the second category here of homes that are making roughly about $75,000 to $80,000, right? We start to see these show up, no view, just a sort of cabinish feel to it. And if we go and look on Zillow, we can see this home right here has no view. You can just tell because they would show off the very first photo with the view if they had it. And this is going for $775,000. And so we'll go back to our underwriting sheet. And for this scenario, I'll use a $600,000 underwriting sheet, and we'll go 775, 1, 2, 3. And then we will change this to let's go 80,000 as the number. Again, you can see the price rent ratio is at about 10%, and the free cash flow is about negative $23,000 a year. And so within, not even kidding, like 2 minutes, I was able to show this to these two clients and be like, I could deep dive this further and maybe find you something that would just break even. But at a very quick glance, I can tell you that there's not really going to be strong cash flowing properties here, because the purchase price of these properties compared to the revenue, the price to rent the price to rent ratio is too low. It's at a 10% from what we saw from just both those deals. And so then therefore, it's not a market that's worth spending your time to deep dive. Go find another market where you can find somewhere around, like, depending on the purchase price, somewhere between a 15% to even all the way up to a 25% price to rent ratio from a very high level. And then you can know that that's a market that's worth your time to deep dive even further to try and figure out if there's actually properties there that are going to work. And then on top of this, guys, there's one last thing I wanted to share. I just thought of it. Once you have actually built out a buy box for the market that you're in, I'm just going to use this as a hypothetical example, okay? Just so I don't have to reload anything here. Hypothetically, let's say that I did know, right, that I knew that there are properties here that could work, and I could know that they would be, let's say, like the max that they could make $200,000 a year. Okay, well, if I go, okay, if they can make $200,000 a year, and we can go back over here. So let's go to our $1 million property. Let's say that this one was making $1 million, right? Let's go one more time. $1 million at 200,000. That's actually a 14, almost 15% cash on cash. So let's say instead that for a $1 million purchase, I'd be okay with making $180,000 a year. Now, I'm not saying this is what you have to make. Like, obviously, you want to try and make more if you can. But let's just say for a quick example, you go 180,000. Go, okay, I know that there's properties in this market that could make $180,000. Again, making this up, $180,000. I can see that. Well, in that case, I'm only going to look at properties that are $1 million or less. And then you click apply, and then you look for them. And then you can take it a step further and go, well, I know I need a view if I'm going to hit that number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want mountain views. And you go apply. And now you have a handful of deals. And then you go, I also know that I need a 4-bedroom plus. And you go, okay, apply. And look how many deals are left, right? Now, if I take off this 4-bedroom plus, the only reason I would do that is if I believed that 3 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms in this market, or even 1 bedrooms, would be worth purchasing with a view to still be able to hit whatever the revenue number would need to be based on their different purchase prices. But if you're creating a buy box and you're really trying to narrow this down, and you've picked out a market, you know it works, and you say, as long as I can find something that is 4+ bedrooms under $1 million, I know it makes sense to purchase. And at that point, you could save this search and say, this market, whatever. You can name it whatever you want. And you save this and you ask for an email instantly. So as soon as the market hits the requirements that you're looking for, it'll pop up. And then you can then know that that's a property that's actually worth investing into based off of that specific market. And so what you've done here by having this using this 20% rule, understanding the 20% rule based on whether you're buying a $200,000 home or a $2 million home, you logically understand it. And then you can go and search all these different markets. And then eventually you're going to find one. And then eventually you're going to build a buy box for it. And then you're going to build a Zillow filter for it. And then Zillow's going to send you deals when they hit that criteria. And you're going to know based off that price rent ratio that that's a deal worth moving forward with. And I think that's pretty cool. And so that's the 20% rule, broken down more. I'll see you guys in the next video.